Kia ora, kofu smithaho. Nā mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. This week at Parliament was Scrutiny Week. It's a sitting week, and MPs were in Wellington, but the House didn't sit. There was no legislation debated and no question time. Instead, the ministers were all expected to spend time fronting hearings in select committees to defend their budget plans. Earlier in the week, as something of a warm-up and an explainer, we interviewed one of the star performers from Scrutiny Week last budget, Lawrence Xu-Nan, who is one of a number of MPs in this Parliament who has done doctoral-level study, so has the brutal research experience that might just be useful for digging into something as labyrinthine and esoteric as the budget. And as his speciality is Egyptology, including translating fragmentary fictional tales from dead languages, well, the budget sounds ideal.
Kia ora. My name is Lawrence Xu-Nan. I'm one of the Green Party MPs. So one of the major roles of being an MP as part of the legislature is to scrutinize the executive on how they make law, being one part of it, and the other part is their budget and how they're going to spend that budget. So that is what we're going to be seeing this week as one of two scrutiny weeks. We'll have hearings with both the minister and the ministry or agency on how they are going to spend the money that they set out in the budget. And so it's what they call the estimates week.
You will have been prepping for this to some extent since the budget. What do you do?
In terms of the questions that we're able to propose, there are sort of four parts to it, and we can talk more about that. So you have the pre-hearing question, you've got a post-budget question, and you've got a post-hearing question. They are kind of like your written questions that you see normally, whereas the preparation for the hearing itself is kind of like your oral questions, and that's when we get to ask some very specific questions, but also, I guess, in some ways, the more spicy questions. When we're looking at preparation, I like to take a very methodological approach. The first thing I always look at a summary of initiatives. So within that, what's new? What has the government introduced that's new? What has the government taken away? That's formed the basis of a number of my questions. Then you go to the actual vote. So, within my portfolio, let's say the two biggest ones are vote education and vote justice. Getting into the really minutiae and going through it line by line, looking at how the budget is being put together, what money is being spent, what money hasn't been spent. So I've normally put together a massive spreadsheet of all of the different questions, going through line by line of the summary initiatives and each of the vote. I then prioritize it. And based on the questions I would like to ask, put it into different themes. And anything I don't get to ask is put aside as post-hearing questions.
I think it would have been last year's budget. You were asking questions in the line of, now, if you look at page 742, you will see on line 17, blah, blah, blah. At times, you seem to be more aware of what was in the budget than the minister you were questioning. You obviously take this very seriously.
Yeah, I think on one hand, I take my role as an MP and as a member of the legislature extremely seriously, particularly around how we hold that checks and balances against the executive. And I think, opposition MPs have a particularly important role for that. Because of my research background, I'm particularly aware that I need to be able to justify the questions I ask and be able to find very quickly where that source is from. So I have it with me all the time.
Right. How many questions do you get to ask?
To be fair, in most cases, when it comes to select committee, let's say education and workforce, for example, regardless of which political party you're from, most people are pretty collegial when it comes to asking questions. And the chair is usually pretty good about dividing the time or allocating the time based on requirement. So often oppositions do get a little bit more time. But I think, if we're looking at maybe roughly 15 minutes or 20 minutes for a long sustained line of primary questions, within an hour, you might be able to get 4 or 5 main questions, but everyone has the ability to sub off each other's questions.
Do you coordinate a little bit between the different parties so that you're not doubling up?
It's MP dependent and it's portfolio dependent. Being able to support each other and being bounced off each other is also another really good way of scrutinizing the executive, because I think at its core, the intention here is to hold the executive account on their budget. It's less about a gotcha moment and more about everyone and the legislature in general working together to scrutinize the executive.
You were talking about pre-questions, the actual committee hearing itself, and then there's an aftermath. Tell me more about those three.
We can put in some pre-hearing questions, and those are a fairly standard list of questions that people may submit.
And they come from the committee itself to the minister?
They come from the committee itself to the ministry. So the really important thing about Scrutiny Week, both in terms of the one this week, but also the one in December, is it's one of the few opportunities that we have to be able to not only ask ministers questions, which we can do normally through written questions, but be able to ask ministry questions. After the pre-hearing questions, when the budget is launched, we're then also able to put in some post-budget questions. And these are the questions on the basis of what is in the budget, and they will be available before the hearing. So that way, if anyone want to prepare more detailed questions based on those responses, they could. And after the hearing, depending on whether you have any questions you weren't able to ask, or if new information came about as a result of the public hearing with the minister or with the ministry or the agency, you can put together post-hearing questions. And that can be fairly substantial. And it also allows the ministry time to digest your question and be able to give you a more fulsome answer.
And sometimes there's things you might ask in the committee that no one can actually answer on the spot. So you give them a chance to go away and come back to you.
Exactly. Although I spend a great deal of time and care in putting together my questions and being able to go through the vote and the summary of initiatives line by line, but I also kind of acknowledge and recognize the fact that not everyone will know every line off by heart, and it's just not feasible. And sometimes you do need to come back with some of those answers. And we do see that happen quite often during hearings.
That was Green MP Lawrence Xu-Nan on Estimates Scrutiny Week and his preparation for it. The more cynical of you might think that that approach is idealistic because politics tends to muddy Parliament's role in providing governance over the government. In Scrutiny Week, politics turns up in both the questions and in the answers. So next, we note a few of the tactics that we observed in committees this last week. The focus is more on the answers because those answering have more tactical options and tend to employ a wider range of techniques. Whoever is in government, though, there are always ministers that genuinely engage in the spirit of the event, and others that seem to just really enjoy the stoush.
Unfortunately, the conditions that we have come into, very high government spending, excessive and wasteful government spending, leading to high interest rates, high inflation, economic recession and job losses, is the reality of what we are dealing with.
Sometimes that's quite understandable because the question itself is just an attack. The question that Louise Upston was answering was from Ginny Anderson.
What part of the budget reflects economic growth, considering we have lower growth, we have wages that are stagnant, we have businesses closing, and there are more people in New Zealand losing their jobs?
The interchange of Scrutiny Week is very different from question time, but some responses are very familiar, like attacking the party of the questioner or dismissing the question.
Well, I reject the member's characterisation.
Well, I reject that assertion.
Well, that doesn't reflect my understanding.
Differing perspectives and policy tensions dictate that some topics are combative, and sometimes ministers employ a range of tactics to avoid answering. Here, Tama Potaka is asked whether he's been told by frontline providers that the government's policies have increased homelessness. And he answers a slightly different question.
Frontline providers have a variety of comments. They're very happy with the amount of tamariki that have come out of emergency housing, being over 3,000. They have also said that we've been very clear around our expectations regarding responsibilities.
A similar approach is just redefining the question.
Well, I think it's important to very, very clearly clarify whether or not you're talking about uninhabitable housing, overcrowding, people staying in motels, which has gone down by 85%, as you know, including children, or rough sleeping. There's a range of different forms used to define what you're talking about.
Another common tactic is eating up time. Possibly the best exponent of that this year was the Minister of Finance, Nicola Willis, whose introductory remarks were lengthy, but who also went long in other ways, like repetition.
That is an important point that I'm making, so I'll make it again.
Or this.
And I would make 2 points. The first is the one that I already explained somewhat laboriously.
Or lengthy digressions.
Given that the Minister took 5 minutes of commentary to answer 30 seconds of, give me 30 seconds on the direct measures.
Was it 5 minutes?
It was. So
You
I do just want to be very focused on this, and if the minister could answer the question.
Ministers only appear in these hearings for a limited time. That primary question stretched for 6.5 minutes before it was finally answered, and that restricts just how many questions can get asked. Different ministers have different approaches to tricky or aggressive questions. Some are surprisingly forthcoming, and others tack away. When asked about the influences behind his policy choices, David Seymour used absurdist humour.
I'm the most urban MP in New Zealand. My main interaction with the dairy industry is probably through a flat white.
Nicola Willis responded to a combative line of questions from Scott Willis like this.
Look, Scott, you're a nice man, but I have to say I find this line of questioning rather perverse.
Sometimes backbencher colleagues or even chairpeople intervene to help out with a point of order, or just offer a very friendly patsy.
I don't know if you have any examples of success stories.
Oddly, sometimes ministers get so involved in the tussle that they avoid answers that are sitting right next to them, i.e. the officials. And sometimes, if the officials can get a word in, it's actually positive, and the minister had no reason to be avoiding it. Here, for example, an official answers a repeat of that earlier question about influence that's aimed at David Seymour.
Is it the case that the agricultural chemical reviews was suggested by you?
So actually the agriculture and chemical was actually suggested initially by us.
From these clips, you might come to the conclusion that Scrutiny Week was an endless and frustrating bear pit. But we saw hearings where ministers from all of the governing parties gave good answers and had constructive interchanges with the committees, sometimes even in contentious areas. But examples of good discussions are almost by definition far too lengthy to include in a short programme. Good politics is never short politics. You've been listening to The House. E te whakaranga koe ki te whare. This programme is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.